Most people think silence means the connection is over. They believe when two people stop talking, the emotions disappear with the conversation. But human psychology does not work that way, especially when the relationship involved an empath and an avoidant. Because when those two personalities become emotionally attached, the ending rarely happens the moment communication stops. In many ways, that is where the real emotional story finally begins. An empath naturally moves toward emotional closeness. They notice energy, behavior, emotional shifts, and unspoken tension. They feel deeply connected to the people they love, and because of that, they often become attached not only to reality, but to potential. They believe patience can heal emotional distance. They believe understanding can fix inconsistency. They believe love, if given deeply enough, can make someone feel safe enough to stay. The avoidant operates from an entirely different emotional system. Intimacy often activates fear inside them. Vulnerability feels overwhelming. So whenever the relationship becomes emotionally intense, their instinct is to create space. Sometimes they pull away physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes through silence. Not always because they do not care, but because closeness itself begins triggering discomfort. They do not fully understand themselves. And for a long time, the relationship becomes a repeating cycle. The empath moves closer, trying to create connection. The avoidant steps back, trying to create safety. The empath asks for reassurance. The avoidant asks for distance. Both people feel misunderstood. Both people feel emotionally exhausted. Yet somehow the bond continues because emotional attachment can survive even inside unhealthy patterns. Months pass, sometimes years. The empath keeps trying harder while the avoidant keeps pulling further away whenever emotions become too intense. Then one day something changes. The empath stops reaching out. No more messages. No more emotional conversations. No more attempts to fix the distance. Suddenly the silence becomes real, and that is the moment everything starts shifting beneath the surface. Most people assume the avoidant immediately moves on while the empath completely falls apart. But the emotional reality is much more complicated than that. The empath usually suffers first because their emotional energy was deeply invested in the relationship. Their mind became connected to the routine, the hope, the emotional attachment, and even the uncertainty itself. When no contact begins, the silence feels overwhelming. The empath starts replaying old conversations in their mind. They analyze every disagreement. Every memory suddenly feels important. They wonder whether they said the wrong thing. They question whether they should have been more patient, more understanding, less emotional, or less demanding. They constantly check their phone, hoping for some sign that the connection still exists. It feels almost like emotional withdrawal, because for so long their attention flowed outward toward another person. Their emotional world became centered around understanding, helping, fixing, and maintaining the relationship. And when the connection disappears, the empath suddenly feels lost inside their own silence. But beneath all that emotional pain, a quiet transformation slowly begins. For the first time in a very long time, their energy is no longer flowing entirely towards someone else. It slowly begins returning back to them. At first, this feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Empaths are often so focused on caring for others that they forget how to care for themselves with the same dedication. The silence forces self-reflection. They begin noticing how emotionally exhausted they became trying to keep the relationship alive. They remember all the moments they ignored their own needs. They start questioning why they accepted emotional inconsistency for so long. And those questions slowly create clarity where confusion once existed. Meanwhile, the avoidant often enters a completely different emotional phase. At first, they may actually feel relief. The emotional pressure disappears. There are no difficult conversations waiting for them, no expectations demanding vulnerability, no emotional intensity forcing them to confront feelings they struggled to manage. The distance feels calming to their nervous system, and this is where the biggest misunderstanding happens. The empath sees the avoidant appearing calm and assumes they never truly cared. Friends may even reinforce this belief by saying things like, "If they loved you, they would already come back." But appearances are deceptive. Relief is not the same as emotional healing. Relief only means the immediate pressure disappeared. The emotional bond itself often remains buried underneath avoidance patterns that have existed for years. And eventually, silence forces both people to confront something they spent the entire relationship avoiding: themselves. That is why no contact changes everything, not because silence magically fixes relationships, but because silence removes distraction. It exposes emotional patterns that remained hidden while the relationship was active. And once those patterns become visible, neither person can see the connection the same way ever again. The hardest part about losing someone is not always losing the person themselves. Sometimes the deepest pain comes from losing the future you imagined with them. And empaths experience this pain more intensely than most people because when they love someone, they do not love halfway. They invest emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. They attach themselves not only to the relationship, but to the hope of what the relationship could eventually become. That is why no contact feels so devastating in the beginning. The empath suddenly wakes up without the emotional connection that once occupied their thoughts every single day. The routine disappears, the conversations disappear, even the uncertainty disappears. And strangely enough, uncertainty itself becomes emotionally addictive when someone spends enough time inside an inconsistent relationship. The empath became used to waiting, wondering, analyzing, hoping, and emotionally holding on. Now, all of that is gone. The silence feels unbearable at first because the empath's mind was trained to constantly focus on the relationship. They check their phone repeatedly throughout the day. They replay old conversations late at night searching for hidden meaning. Every memory suddenly feels important. Every small detail becomes something to analyze. They ask themselves painful questions over and over again. Did I ask for too much? Was I too emotional? Should I have been more patient? Should I reach out one more time? Because empaths naturally look inward first when relationships break apart. Instead of immediately blaming the other person, they search for ways they may have failed. They try to understand the pain of the person who hurt them while ignoring the pain inside themselves, and that emotional habit becomes dangerous. The empath spends so much time trying to understand the avoidant that they slowly abandon themselves in the process. They prioritize connection over emotional balance. They tolerate inconsistency because they believe love requires sacrifice. They continue giving emotional energy even when they feel emotionally drained themselves. But eventually, the silence begins creating something unexpected: self-reflection. For the first time in a long time, there is nobody left to emotionally chase, nobody left to rescue, nobody left to fix. The empath is finally forced to sit alone with their own thoughts and feelings instead of constantly focusing on someone else's emotional world. At first, this feels uncomfortable, but slowly, clarity begins replacing confusion. The empath starts noticing how emotionally exhausted they truly became. They remember all the moments they ignored their own needs trying to maintain closeness. They realize how often they accepted uncertainty because they feared losing the connection completely. And then a powerful question begins appearing in their mind: why was I always the one trying so hard? That question becomes the beginning of healing, because real healing does not start when the avoidant comes back. Real healing begins the moment the empath stops making the relationship the center of their entire emotional identity. Meanwhile, the avoidant often appears calm during this stage. This is what creates so much confusion for the empath. While they are suffering intensely, the avoidant seems completely unaffected. They continue their normal routines. They focus on work, distractions, hobbies, or daily life. Sometimes they even appear happier. The empath sees this and immediately assumes the relationship never mattered to them. But that assumption is not always true. Avoidants process emotions differently. They learned long ago how to survive emotional overwhelm by creating distance. Whenever emotions become too intense, they disconnect from them instead of confronting them directly. It becomes an automatic coping strategy. So during the beginning of no contact, the avoidant often experiences relief instead of grief. The pressure is gone. The difficult conversations are gone. The emotional intensity disappears. Their nervous system finally feels calm again. But relief is not the same thing as emotional healing. Relief simply means the immediate pressure no longer exists. The emotional bond itself still remains beneath the surface. And this is where the emotional timeline begins reversing in ways most people never expect. While the empath feels the pain first, they also begin healing first. The silence slowly teaches them self-awareness. It forces them to reconnect with themselves instead of constantly focusing on another person. The avoidant, however, is unknowingly walking toward delayed emotional reflection, because emotions ignored are never truly gone. Eventually, the distractions become quieter. Eventually, the silence feels different. Eventually, memories begin resurfacing. And by the time the avoidant starts truly feeling the absence, the empath is often becoming emotionally stronger than they were before. That is the hidden psychological shift nobody sees in the beginning of no contact. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidance is the belief that they do not feel deeply. People often assume that because an avoidant creates distance, struggles with vulnerability, or becomes emotionally unavailable during difficult moments, they simply do not care. But the reality is far more complicated than that. In many cases, the problem is not the absence of emotion. The problem is what happens when emotions become too intense for them to comfortably manage. That is why the avoidant usually feels the breakup later. During the relationship, their emotional defenses stay highly active. Every deep conversation feels emotionally demanding. Every request for reassurance creates internal pressure. Intimacy itself can begin activating fears they may not even fully understand. The closer someone gets to them emotionally, the more vulnerable they feel. And for many avoidants, vulnerability feels unsafe. So instead of moving closer when emotions grow stronger, they instinctively create distance. Sometimes they withdraw emotionally, sometimes physically, sometimes through silence, not always because they want to lose the relationship, but because emotional closeness overwhelms their nervous system. Distance becomes their way of regaining emotional control. But once no contact begins, something unexpected happens. The pressure disappears. Suddenly, there are no difficult conversations waiting for them, no emotional demands, no constant reminders of vulnerability. Their nervous system relaxes because the relationship no longer feels emotionally overwhelming in real time. At first, this relief can make it seem like the avoidant has completely moved on. They continue their routines. They focus on work, hobbies, distractions, or personal independence. To outsiders, they may even appear happier. But beneath that calm surface, something slowly begins changing. Without realizing it, the avoidant's emotional defenses start becoming quieter. The emotional alarm system that once pushed them away no longer has immediate pressure to react against, and that creates space for reflection. This is the stage almost nobody talks about. Small memories begin appearing unexpectedly. A familiar song suddenly reminds them of the empath. A late-night silence creates emotional reflection. A familiar location triggers memories they thought they had forgotten. And slowly, the avoidant begins remembering the relationship differently. Not only the emotional intensity, not only the pressure, but the comfort. They remember the loyalty, the consistency, the support, the simple feeling of knowing someone genuinely cared about them. Ironically, many avoidants only begin fully appreciating certain parts of the relationship after the relationship is already gone. Because distance removes the fear that prevented them from emotionally relaxing while the connection still existed. The empath who once felt emotionally overwhelming now feels emotionally comforting. The relationship that once triggered anxiety now feels meaningful. And this realization creates confusion inside the avoidant because the emotional timeline feels reversed. While the empath experienced the deepest pain in the beginning, the avoidant now begins encountering emotions that were delayed for weeks or even months. This is why some avoidants suddenly feel emotional long after the breakup appears finished. By then, the distractions become weaker, the emotional defenses become quieter, and without the pressure of intimacy activating fear, they finally become capable of emotionally accessing the connection itself. Meanwhile, something equally powerful is happening on the empath side. The empath is no longer chasing. For a long time, the emotional balance of the relationship depended on pursuit. The empath reached out first. The empath tried fixing misunderstandings. The empath carried much of the emotional responsibility, and without even realizing it, both people became psychologically dependent on those roles. The avoidant expected space. The empath expected pursuit. But now the silence changes everything. The messages stop. The emotional labor stops. The chasing stops. And psychologically, this shift becomes enormous. For the first time, the avoidant is no longer reacting to someone constantly trying to close the emotional distance. And for the first time, the empath is no longer defining their identity through emotional pursuit. Both people suddenly stand in unfamiliar emotional territory. The empath begins discovering emotional independence. The avoidant begins experiencing emotional absence. And that is where the old relationship dynamic starts collapsing completely. Because once the empath stops chasing and the avoidant starts truly feeling the silence, the emotional balance of the connection can never fully return to what it once was. Most people misunderstand power inside emotional relationships. They think power means control. They think it means making someone jealous, forcing someone to miss you, or emotionally manipulating another person into returning. But real emotional power has nothing to do with control. Real power begins the moment someone stops abandoning themselves just to keep another person close. And that is exactly what starts happening during no contact. For a very long time, the empath may have unconsciously built their identity around emotional pursuit. They became the helper, the fixer, the emotional caretaker. Their sense of purpose slowly became connected to maintaining the relationship no matter how emotionally draining it became. They kept trying to understand the avoidant's fears, moods, distance, and emotional inconsistency while ignoring their own emotional exhaustion. Meanwhile, the avoidant became comfortable inside the opposite role. They learned to survive emotional discomfort through distance. Whenever the relationship became too emotionally intense, they pulled back to regain a sense of safety and control. Over time, both people unknowingly became trapped inside roles that kept the cycle alive. The empath chased connection. The avoidant chased space. The empath feared abandonment. The avoidant feared emotional overwhelm. And although the relationship felt painful, it also felt strangely familiar to both people because emotional patterns repeated long enough eventually start feeling normal. Then no contact changes everything. The empath stops reaching out, stops trying to repair every emotional distance, stops carrying the entire emotional weight of the relationship alone. And psychologically, this creates one of the biggest shifts the avoidant can experience, because for the first time, nobody is chasing them anymore. At first, the avoidant may still continue life as usual, but slowly the silence begins feeling different. The emotional safety they once found through distance no longer feels as comforting because now there is nothing left to react against. There are no arguments, no pressure, no emotional pursuit, only absence. And absence has a powerful way of exposing emotional truth. Meanwhile, the empath begins experiencing a completely different internal transformation. The person who once spent hours analyzing messages and trying to maintain emotional closeness slowly begins reconnecting with themselves again. Their focus gradually shifts away from the avoidant and back toward their own emotional needs, goals, peace, and self-respect. At first, this feels unnatural because the empath became emotionally conditioned to focus outward instead of inward. They became used to fixing problems, saving relationships, and rescuing emotionally distant people. But over time, the silence teaches them something important. Love should not require self-destruction. They begin realizing how much emotional energy they sacrifice trying to hold the relationship together. They notice how often they ignored red flags, accepted inconsistency, and tolerated emotional uncertainty because they feared losing the connection entirely. And this awareness changes the entire power dynamic, not because the empath is suddenly trying to gain control, but because dependency itself begins shifting. For a long time, the empath depended on the relationship for emotional reassurance and validation. They wanted certainty, connection, and closeness. The avoidant, on the other hand, depended on something completely different. They depended on the fact that the empath was almost always emotionally available no matter how distant things became. Now that emotional system collapses, the empath is forced to face life without chasing. The avoidant is forced to face life without being chased, and both experiences feel deeply uncomfortable. The empath may realize how much of their self-worth became connected to helping and rescuing others. The avoidant may realize how much of their identity became connected to maintaining emotional distance and protecting themselves from vulnerability. Neither realization feels easy because both people are confronting emotional survival strategies they carried for years. But this is where genuine growth finally becomes possible. Because without awareness, old patterns remain invisible, and invisible patterns always repeat themselves. This is also the stage where many people begin asking the wrong question. They obsess over whether the avoidant will come back instead of asking whether either person has truly changed. Because reconciliation without emotional growth usually recreates the exact same cycle that destroyed the relationship the first time. The empath starts chasing again, the avoidant starts withdrawing again, and nothing truly changes beneath the temporary excitement of reunion. That is why no contact is not magical by itself. Silence alone does not create maturity. Time alone does not heal emotional patterns. Real transformation only happens when both people become willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The empath must learn self-respect without needing constant reassurance. The avoidant must learn vulnerability without immediately escaping from it. And only then can the relationship become something different than it was before, because real emotional power is not about controlling another person. It is about finally learning how to stop losing yourself while trying to keep someone else. The question people ask more than any other after no contact is simple. Will the avoidant come back? But that question often distracts people from something far more important. If they return, will anything actually be different? Because many relationships do not fail due to lack of love. They fail because the emotional patterns inside the relationship remain unhealthy and unchanged. And when two people reconnect without emotional growth, the same cycle eventually repeats itself no matter how strong the chemistry feels in the beginning. At first, reunion can feel powerful. The messages return, the conversations return, the emotional connection suddenly feels alive again. The empath feels hope, the avoidant feels relief. Both people convince themselves this time will be different because separation created emotional longing. But longing is not the same thing as transformation. For a short period, everything feels exciting again. The empath feels emotionally chosen. The avoidant feels emotionally safe because the relationship is temporarily peaceful. Old pain seems forgotten. Both people focus on the connection instead of the deeper emotional patterns underneath it. But eventually, reality begins resurfacing. The empath slowly starts needing reassurance again. The avoidant slowly starts feeling emotional pressure again. The empath moves closer emotionally, trying to rebuild certainty. The avoidant instinctively starts pulling away to regain space. And suddenly, the same emotional dance begins repeating itself all over again. Not because either person is evil, not because they do not love each other, but because emotional survival patterns do not disappear simply because two people missed each other during separation. This is why no contact by itself is not some magical solution. Silence alone does not heal emotional wounds. Time alone does not create maturity. Distance alone does not create self-awareness. Real change only happens through honesty and reflection. The empath must eventually confront difficult truths about themselves. They must ask why they accepted emotional inconsistency for so long, why they attached their self-worth to someone else's ability to stay emotionally available, why they kept sacrificing their own peace trying to maintain a connection that constantly left them emotionally exhausted. And those realizations are painful because empaths often confuse self-sacrifice with love. They believe giving more patience, more understanding, and more emotional energy will eventually create security inside the relationship. But love without boundaries slowly destroys emotional balance. Meanwhile, the avoidant must confront an entirely different emotional truth. They must understand why vulnerability feels threatening, why emotional closeness activates fear instead of comfort, why they instinctively create distance whenever intimacy becomes emotionally intense, and perhaps most importantly, why they often begin appreciating emotional connection only after the relationship is no longer immediately available. Because this is the hidden paradox of avoidance. Many avoidants feel emotionally safer after separation than during intimacy itself. Once the pressure of closeness disappears, they finally become capable of accessing emotions they spent the relationship suppressing. They begin missing the comfort, loyalty, consistency, and emotional safety the empath provided, but missing someone and becoming emotionally available are not always the same thing. That is the difficult truth many people avoid hearing. An avoidant may genuinely miss the empath deeply while still struggling to maintain healthy emotional intimacy if the deeper issues inside them remain unresolved. And the empath may genuinely love the avoidant while still needing to learn how to stop abandoning themselves emotionally for the sake of connection. That is why growth matters more than reunion itself. Without growth, the relationship becomes a temporary emotional reunion followed by the same emotional collapse. The same arguments return. The same fears return. The same emotional imbalance slowly reappears. But when both people genuinely confront themselves during no contact, something different becomes possible. The empath learns self-respect instead of emotional overgiving. The avoidant learns vulnerability instead of emotional escape. And suddenly, the relationship is no longer built on fear and emotional dependency. It becomes built on awareness. Because healthy love is not about chasing someone who constantly runs away. And it is not about running from someone who simply wants emotional closeness. Healthy love requires two people who are both emotionally willing to stay present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. That is why the real purpose of no contact is not manipulation. It is not revenge, and it is not about forcing someone to miss you. Its real purpose is revelation. The silence exposes emotional patterns both people were too distracted to fully see while the relationship was active. It forces self-confrontation, it forces emotional awareness, and eventually it forces both people to decide whether they want to return to familiar pain or finally choose emotional growth instead, because only one of those choices leads to a different future. Silence reveals truths that emotional chaos often hides. That is why no contact changes people so deeply. In the beginning, both the empath and the avoidant believe the silence means something completely different. The empath sees silence as rejection. The avoidant sees silence as relief. But as time continues passing, the emotional meaning of that silence slowly begins changing for both people in ways neither of them expected. The empath usually enters no contact carrying overwhelming emotional pain. Their mind becomes flooded with questions, memories, regrets, and emotional confusion. They replay conversations repeatedly trying to understand where everything went wrong. They miss the connection so intensely that at first they remember mostly the good moments. Their emotions blur reality. They focus on potential instead of truth. They hold on to the version of the relationship they hoped could exist someday. But silence has a strange way of clearing emotional fog. As weeks pass, the empath slowly begins seeing the relationship more honestly. They stop viewing the avoidant as an emotional fantasy and start seeing them as a real human being with both strengths and weaknesses. They remember the love, but they also remember the inconsistency. They remember the connection, but they also remember the emotional exhaustion. They remember all the moments they felt anxious, uncertain, emotionally drained, and alone even while technically being in a relationship. And this realization becomes powerful because for the first time the empath begins understanding that love should not constantly require suffering in order to survive. They begin realizing how much of themselves they lost while trying to maintain emotional closeness with someone who feared intimacy itself. Slowly, the empath stops chasing answers, stops checking their phone every hour, stops building their identity around another person's emotional availability. And in that silence, they begin rediscovering themselves again. Meanwhile, something equally important is happening on the avoidance side. At first, the avoidant felt emotionally safe because the pressure disappeared. There were no difficult conversations, no emotional demands, no vulnerability forcing them outside their comfort zone. The silence felt calm in the beginning because distance has always been their way of emotionally regulating themselves, but eventually the silence changes form, the distractions become quieter, the emotional defenses weaken, and memories begin surfacing more frequently. The avoidant starts noticing the absence in unexpected moments. A song reminds them of the empath. A quiet evening creates emotional reflection. Familiar places suddenly feel emotionally different. And slowly, they begin feeling the emotional weight of what they lost. This is the hidden paradox of avoidance. Many avoidants only fully access their emotions after separation because separation removes the emotional pressure that once activated fear inside them. Once the relationship is no longer demanding vulnerability in real time, their nervous system finally relaxes enough for reflection to happen. And reflection changes perspective. The empath who once felt emotionally overwhelming now feels comforting. The relationship that once felt emotionally intense now feels meaningful. The emotional consistency they once took for granted now feels rare and valuable. But by the time these realizations appear, the empath may already be changing. The person who once waited desperately for reassurance is slowly becoming emotionally independent. The person who once chased connection at all costs is learning boundaries, self-respect, and emotional balance. The silence that once felt unbearable now begins creating emotional freedom. And this is where the deepest truth about no contact finally reveals itself. No contact is not truly about making someone return. It is not about punishment, and it is not about winning. Its real purpose is self-confrontation. The silence forces both people to meet the parts of themselves they spent years avoiding. The empath must confront their fear of abandonment and their habit of sacrificing themselves for love. The avoidant must confront their fear of vulnerability and their instinct to escape emotional closeness whenever intimacy becomes uncomfortable. Because eventually, every empath and every avoidant reaches the same emotional crossroads: return to familiar patterns because they feel safe, or choose emotional growth even when growth feels terrifying. And that choice determines everything that happens next. Sometimes no contact becomes the end of the relationship forever. Sometimes it creates the beginning of a healthier connection built on awareness instead of emotional survival patterns. But regardless of the outcome, the greatest transformation is not what happens between the two people. It is what happens within them. Because eventually both people realize the answers they spent searching for in each other were actually lessons they needed to learn about themselves all along. And once that realization truly happens, silence no longer feels like an ending. It feels like awakening.